Now, if you're not a founder and you're listening, this is going to be a good conversation for you as well. But I think the lens that Christopher works with clients, or Christopher, you typically work with sort of founder-led sellers. And so that's the lens that you're bringing to this conversation. So if you're an AE, if you're a sales manager, I still think there's going to be some really valuable learnings based on the pre-conversations that Christopher and I have had, but just understand ahead of time, it's coming through the lens of founder-led selling. Fair setup, Christopher?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're gonna go deep and set up, like you said, a context and a framework to have more powerful sales conversations that create more clarity for anyone who's having a sales conversations. And you're right, I specifically work with founder sellers.
One of the things that, if you've listened to the show for a while, you've probably heard me rant about is the first $1 million in sales is a function of product, not sales. And that means, when you're trying to figure out what product to build, whether it's a service, whether it's an actual piece of software, there is something you do, customer development interviews. And, the word customer development interviews implies that they will eventually become customers. And to me, the conclusion of a set of customer development interviews and that sort of customer development process is the conversion of these hypothetical customers into actual customers that represent revenue. Thus, the first $1 million is a product or an extension of your customer development exercise. And so you create all these hypotheses and then you validate them by asking for money. And what that typically looks like is beta users that eventually turn into paying users, that eventually turn into companies that refer you to other companies that turn into more customers. That's generally how I see that sort of early founder kind of sales growth. I'd love to throw it to Christopher and, when you think about that first $1 million, are we sort of aligned? Do you see it differently? And like how and where should founders be involved in this process?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, Colin. And it's something that is on our schedule today to talk about, like when it makes sense to hire salespeople. But that like making sure that you have those customer development conversations so you can really dial in your market, like who are your people, what's their problem, what's the solution, what's your offer, what's the results, and really have that sorted out ahead of time, plus kind of prototype whatever systems are required, is the job of the founder, right? And early on, it's to keep cash flow coming into the business so that there's money available to make the investments that are required. And there's no better person to do that for that first $1 million than a founder. Mm-hmm. I think at that, like I was saying, Colin, it depends on the nature of the business and what the business ultimately wants to do. I think generically, you're going to want, as a founder, CEO, founder, seller, you're going to want to hire someone to take some of the lower dollar tasks and activities off your plate. And I actually think that should start to happen way before the $1 million mark, but I would continue to build your support team as a CEO or founder to pull some of those lower dollar tasks off your plate. And then the second hire, I would continue to build out your client delivery team and your service team. So as a founder, you can continue to focus on business development and driving revenue into the business. I even think, and we may have a different perspective here, which is great, or we may be in alignment. I think, onboarding, there's some challenges to onboarding a sales team, right? And bringing in when it's actually, it makes sense. And I think it's less a revenue threshold than it is kind of some of the foundation that's in place for the business and the growth that the business actually wants to achieve informs when you should actually start looking at bringing on a sales person. I know from the majority of founders and CEOs that I've talked with and that I've had experience working with and even working in large organization, I've seen founder-led sales organizations up to $40 million. I've seen agencies with only founders and CEOs that are 10, 11, $12 million with only founder sellers. So I know, and I've done the pro formas and the financials for those businesses, and at the deal sizes they sell, you can get a lot of momentum and revenue from a founder-led sales effort. So at that $1 million level, I think it's really about bringing in some people to help support what you're doing and freeing up your time, and then really bringing in some people who can help you on the delivery side of the business so you can focus on strategy, building team, and high-level BD activities.
Yeah. So these things take time. Customers take a while to develop, to realize that, hey, this is going to be a great fit. I think one of the sneaky benefits of outbound that most people don't realize because they don't do a great job of nurturing, and this is probably true for, I'd say this is true for salespeople. It certainly was for me as a salesperson when I was first figuring it out, is that most don't have a system in place to work those nurturers long term to actually get the value. You might get people coming back in 12 months or 18 months, or even like we get tons of old customers coming back to us. They're like, hey, we worked with you for 6 months, and then 6 months later, a bunch of deals closed. We're like, They're like, okay, now we're back. You're like, great. And then they'll stay for a very long time. But I think, to your point, it does take time. I want you to talk about, tell me a little about these systems, because I totally agree. There's so much of this is a systems game. What are the core systems, and how do you think about sales systems how do you think about sales systems?
Yeah. So when I think about building a business that can profitably make sales and create the conversations it needs and have those conversations, I think of a foundation of sales-ready people and sales-ready systems. So like people is the first system, and then I'll share some of the other systems. But those two systems, people and systems, form the foundation of what I call a sales-ready organization, Colin. And the sales-ready organization framework creates clarity on what to do and a structured way to actually do it. So what's so important about having a framework for wrapping your revenue generating activities around is it prevents you from building and creating things that actually don't lead to driving revenue, which actually creates a ton of waste in your process. One of the ways that I help my clients add revenue with less sales work is I go and I look at their systems, most of which they're not using. And then the ones they're using, they're just not using effectively. And I'm like, that's just like clean all that shit out and stop doing a lot of this. And then the second way to help clients is just to actually do some of the work for them. But by far, the way to eliminate waste is just to look at things that have cluttered up their business over the years and years of working with, all their clients, all their employees, and all kind of the weight of all that, which isn't actually supporting the business. It's not the right foundation for where that business is going. So, when I think of those systems, there's really 5 core systems to being a sales-ready organization. It's your mindset, right? It's your leadership systems. So, what do you actually want? What are your goals? How are you reporting on that? It's your marketing systems. So really, how are you creating conversations? It's your sales systems, and then it's your project management systems. So, and that's just on, I would just say on the revenue side, I don't really touch like client delivery, but it's, for revenue, for adding revenue, it's mindset, leadership, marketing, sales, and project management. People typically miss mindset because they think it's too woo-woo or spiritual, right? They don't really connect that in as a revenue generating activity, especially if they've never worked with someone in that capacity. But especially in sales, because we have so many stories around strangers and money, like mindset is super important for salespeople in particular. So having some coaching there is super important. And then they always miss project management. Like, there's like, they don't view, it depends on business level maturity or entrepreneurial maturity, but they don't view sales as like an ongoing project, or like they'll be like, hey, I set up my CRM, where CRM or revenue ops is something you need to do all the time and needs to be actively improved and managed all the time. So those are kind of the core sales ready organization systems. And that's what I work with my clients on, is really getting those systems in place, understanding, what you're doing well, what you're not doing so well, and kind of what's missing completely. Because sometimes it's just like a small thing that's missing, But if you don't have that framework, that checklist to understand what needs to be put in place, it's like a race car, man. Like if the race car doesn't have a steering wheel or a gas tank, you're going to have a pretty bad day as a race car driver. So
yeah, you'll be stagnant.
and regardless of what process or framework you use, what I see a lot is people start building out their tools before understanding their strategy and their process. So they'll set up their CRM. They'll be like, I need enablement. I need these automations. I need a website. I need a podcast. I need to write a book. Like I need to do all of these things, but then none of those things they actually build out connect into a marketing process or a sales process, right? So then when I walk in and I assess organizations, I see hundreds of documents and tools that they've spent hours and hours and tens of thousands of dollars on, or hundreds of thousands of dollars on, that they're not using anymore. And that actually aren't white papers, case studies, email, like all that stuff. So it's much better to start with your process and be like, we have a 3 conversation workflow. And on this first conversation, I need a script and a follow-up email to send, and then build the tools to support that process and hang that stuff on the process. So I see that all the time, and that's a huge mistake to do it that way.
I think this is, as a founder, not coming from sales, this is probably one of the hardest things to figure out. Because if I'm in the role of a founder who just built the product or is in the process of building a product, I want to show up and be like, look at the stuff that I built. And even when I was a founder, I come from sales. I spent 10, 11 years selling before I did this, and I still did that because you're so excited. It's like when you have a newborn, you're like, look at my cute baby. You're like, that thing is hideous.
Yes. It's kind of ugly, but yeah.
And the good sales father is like, do you want to see a picture of my kids? And you can tell somebody's like, oh yeah, I'll show you some of mine. Or like, nah, I don't want to see your frog. I don't care.
Yep.
And I think that's the kind of analogy. And so I'd love to understand your take on the sort of core components of a sales conversation.
Yeah. Well, first there's, we'll get into like the tactics of an actual sales conversation, but I think you hit the nail on the head there. Like it's a shift around what the purpose of a sales conversation actually is. And it's not, and I think a lot of this comes from this learned pitch culture where we learn to like create something and then pitch it out there, which is not how B2B businesses actually sell. And that takes some work like internally to make that shift, because humans are naturally eye-centric, and you've spent all that time having that baby or making that product, right? And you think it's awesome, and it is just for some people, but not for everybody. And you need to start to realize that sales has nothing to do with you as the seller, right? And it's shifting whether you call it, we-centric or you-centric, or you call it sales synonymous with love, buyer-centric, like I think, or showing up in service instead of get energy. You're not there to get something as a sales. You're not even there to make a sales, right? Like a goal is to make sales, but not with that particular person. I had a mentor say to me, that sales isn't something that you do to someone. Sales is something that you do for someone. And it's really a place of service. And that is like that truth of sales synonymous with love. And I think if you show up with that intention, it'll really, and the intention I mean is just to help the other person. A sales conversation is just about helping the other person. And if you help people, they'll buy, so that shift is the first shift, which is so hard for new. You have two problems going on with most sales conversation. Is one, the founder loves their product and they just want to talk about their product. And two, people think early salespeople want to make a sale. They want to get money. You need to get that money, right? And those two things are killer for those, lead to really bad sales conversations. So,
and I think that second piece comes from a lot of the early sales books where it's like, this is how you convince somebody to buy. Right. Like I think there was a period like in the 90s and early aughts where like there were so many books on like NLP and so many books on, this is how you do the yes ladder and this is how you get them to say yes. And it's like, I grew up reading those and I was like, this doesn't feel right. Because the first book I ever read was Miller Hyman, New Strategic Selling. And it talks about how to understand your buyer. And if I'm like, I 100% agree. This is the buyer's journey. We are just guides. And the role of the salesperson is to understand the problem. Be like, hey, talk to me about your problem. I understand the problem. That we solve really well. Let's see if your problem looks like that shape. And if it does, cool. And if there's a couple rough edges, then I'll be like, hey, this is where it's not going to be as good. That's where it's not going to be as good. But the moment that I think it like really helped visualize it for me, I was reading a non-sales book, Nancy Duarte's Resonate, and she was talking about presentations. And the role of the presenter is not the hero, they were talking about the hero's journey. The role of the presenter is not the hero. And if we take the Star Wars analogy, you are not Luke Skywalker, you are Yoda, an important character, but you're hardly in the movie. The whole movie is about Luke. The whole buying journey is about the buyer. You're just a little tiny green person. So like, ask a couple of questions in a very strange backward way, and then shut up and let the movie focus on the hero.
So I hinted at that sales conversations aren't about making a sale. So the question might be, what are sales conversations actually about? Right. So
just running this podcast for me.
no problem. I'm the Yoda of this podcast. You're the star. I'm the Yoda. Or maybe you're supposed to be the Yoda. I don't know.
I'm supposed to be the Yoda. I might have been too much Luke.
Maybe you're Luke Skywalker. Who knows? I think sales conversations are about creating clarity for the buyer, really around what it is that they want. Right. So what's the outcome or goal? So it's really about creating clarity, and then a yes or no on if they want what they say they want. So in a sales conversation, you're trying to really create that clarity. Well, you're trying to create that clarity around what that person wants, right? And you do that by asking questions about that, and then understanding the issues or the problems about what's preventing them from having what it is they want. Okay. And, what you're really looking there for as the salesperson is fit. You're going, can I, or can my company help that person have what they want, whether that's to solve a problem or achieve an aspiration, and it's kind of how those two frame up. And like, is that something my company helps people do that? And are the challenges and problems that they're experiencing something that we're equipped to help guide them or move them through? So that's fit. And then if there's fit, like that's when you can, see if that person is really committed into having what they say they want, and help them tap into their urgency. And there's some questions that I'm sure and that, I work with my clients on, but it's really like, is that person, do they urgently want to solve that because there's some type of impact or consequences, like how the sales books talk about it? Because if there's no urgency, that person's never going to buy, and you can just end the call and pop off the call. Like, that's where you're like, there's no urgency. And then because there's no urgency, that person's not going to be in a yes to change, because change and growth is difficult, and they're going to be in a no. And so now you have clarity on what that person wants. And then the last piece of clarity is like, is that person a yes or a no to buy from you? And it's actually like a really simple conversation. And, if you can help people get clear on what they want and what their problems are, and you can present a solution that helps them do that, you can have really nice, helpful conversations. And you're not trying to help that person, Colin, you're not trying to help that person only after. This is why my positive intention is to help, right? My positive intention isn't to sell them something that helps them. It's literally to help them buy that conversation. The gift in a sales conversation is that the conversation itself is helpful, and you demonstrate expertise. You achieve know, like, and trust. You deliver value and rapport, not by handing you a white paper and giving you something, by but by actually knowing how to have a sales conversation that helps that person look at what it is they really want and what problems are really going on. And if you can develop a skill around having that sales conversation, you're going to help a lot of people and you're going to make a lot of money in the process.
How do you work with a client and come up with these conversations or these questions?
I think there's kind of two parts you're checking for, which is just clarity on what they want and what their issue is, right? And then you have some logistical questions, which you may or may not need to include, like in particular, like, and they're more important for larger B2B deals, right? It depends on, but it may be like, who else is involved in this decision, right? Am I selling into a buying committee, or am I having a one-on-one with a founder, CEO of a smaller who's like in charge of everything? There may be a parameter question, like what are the success criteria for this project, which is for a larger deal, you might want to get really dialed in. But for most sales conversations, those logistical parameter type questions don't come up. And I don't actually think are as important as like just literally asking the person what it is that they want, like what is the outcome that they're hoping to achieve, and really hanging in that question. And then from there, just like really understanding like what's preventing them from achieving that, like what are the issues, right? And I think just with those two questions, you can have a really beautiful conversation, right? It's literally just those two questions. And you have to be willing to like really stay in those questions as a human and like unpack those and give them some space to breathe. And then from there, it's like just like trying to understand, a question around understanding if this is important to them or if they're urgent to solve this, right? And there's some ways to do that. And then just asking, is this something, are they committed? Are they willing to solving that, do they really want what they say they want? And if all of those, that right there is a real gift. And if all of that is in alignment, then, and you can help them have what they want, then that's when you can move into talking about, a solution or a product. But I think, if you lead with a demo or a product, it's like, you're just pitching at that point. Right. And that's a really challenging, I don't think there's any, and you're also, there's a bit of a disservice when that happens, because you're kind of leaving the buyer you're saying, hey, here's some shit. Here's some stuff. Apologies.
That's okay.
Here's some stuff. I apologize, not for the language, but for diminishing how hard and what people actually work on. But here's some stuff, because that's how the buyer views it. And then assuming that they're the expert that can correctly evaluate whether that thing will solve their problem, right? Instead of you being that guide or that expert to understand actually what's going on, and then advising them on what's required to have the result that they're looking for. Like I've worked with 100+ sales organizations as a consultant at this point, right? And done many more CRM implementations than that, and sold for and developed processes and systems for multiple Fortune 500 companies. And I'm not saying like these founders aren't experienced or able to do that, or your buyers aren't experienced in what they do because they understand the business so well, to your point. But in terms of the problem space and the solutions and what the market is doing and what's working and not working, you're really in the expert role there. So you need to show up with that expertise with those good questions. So,
and I think a piece to, if if you're listening, a piece to maybe double click on is what you said about holding space for the problem. This is slowing down and not doing what I've been doing all episode and just jumping in all the time. And I'm getting excited and I want to add on. That is not the right way not a great way to run a podcast, not a great way to run a sales conversation. I'm doing this because I'm excited. The buyer is doing this because they're trying to solve a problem. And we're trying to understand the size and the shape of that problem. And so I think that was one thing I also struggled with, was getting away from bam, 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 and getting into help me understand the problem in like the entire edges, like all edges of the problem, size, shape, dimensions in 3D before I start talking about my solution. When you're talking about urgency, it's the T in timing, right? So how are you asking about urgency without just saying, hey, like, are you ready to buy now? Like, how do you bring that up?
I don't know. I think each person can find their own questions, but you can ask things like, why now? What about this is driving you crazy, right? What happens if this doesn't change? What's it worth to you to make this change, right? You can, I don't know, like, you can ask someone like, why is this urgent? Like, is this urgent for you? Right. And some people like find that question a little too direct, and their ego may be too involved to like actually answer that. But I find like just going like, hey, is this actually urgent for you? Because if it's not, you're just never going to buy, and I coach, like, part of that's because I coach on mindset. So like I can be a little bit more, I find myself able to like be more direct about that and just go like, is this actually urgent for you? And talk about why, if it's not urgent, it doesn't matter what my solution is. You're just never going to buy, because you're not going to want to go through the change and growth process to have what it is that you want. So, but those are questions like, why is this important? What's driving you crazy? What happens if this doesn't change, right? What are the consequences, if you don't solve this, make this change, realize this result, so does that help?
Totally. And does that tend to lead into like willingness to change, or is that,
I think willingness to change is kind of its own piece. And that's really where you want to just understand if someone's committed to doing the work. And I think that's not just for making the sale, but like if you're selling, whatever you're selling, whether it's a CRM implementation or a 12-month consulting engagement, right? Like you really want to know that person's going to hang in there and do the work, and that they're available to do the work. So it's not only for them, like, that they really want to do it, but like if you want to lose weight, you got to change your eating habits and go to the gym more. Like there's a lot of activity and work there. And so you want to make sure that person really is committed to that, which actually will help you make the sale because they actually want what they say they want. But it also helps you understand that you have a client that's going to create the result, because it's way more fun when your clients realize the result and use your services to create the result that they're going for than, not being willing to do the work. A sales conversation should be a designed conversation. It's a very particular conversation. You good?
Yeah. We'll keep going.
So a sales conversation is it's a very formal conversation held as informally and conversationally as you can do, right? But you should definitely design it. And when you do that, like I said, you're going to have higher close rates. You're going to not waste your time. You're not going to waste your buyer's time. You're going to show up more authentically and not try to get anything, in terms of like helping founder sellers with this. Like, I know by improving your sales conversations and being sales ready, like founders can add $500,000 to $1 million in revenue, like in 6 months, like very, very quickly. and more than that, depending on the service offering and the size of the business. So that's what I would say the main impact is. It's just confidence. It's like having a tool there. It's a skill. That was the other thing about salespeople. Like salespeople don't work out because they just don't have the skill around knowing how to have a sales conversation. And once you learn that as a founder yourself, how to really have those sales conversations, then you can teach that to your salespeople and scale your team.
Exactly. I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast, Christopher. If people are looking to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah. So if you're a founder seller looking to add more revenue with less sales work, reach out to me. It's very likely that I can help you. The best way to do that is to send me an email at christopher@christopherfilipiak.com. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm fairly active there as Christopher Filipiak. And my website is christopherfilipiak.com. There's a really nice set of data there that makes a case for founder sellers and kind of can answer some questions on, when to hang with founder seller only or when to start to transition to sales, to build, like, to scale your sales team. So those 3 ways: email address, website, LinkedIn.